What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we are going to be making an RC controller. So this week's going to be a little bit different than usual. Things have been crazy busy lately, so I just wanted to have some fun this week and create a good old hard surface high poly model. So I came across this image online and I thought it would be a lot of fun to recreate for this week's video. So a really big shout out to the artist who created this image, and I will also put the link in the description to this reference if you want to take a look. If you're familiar with this channel, you'll know I usually create these models on my weekends. However, with lots of stuff coming up, I thought I would try to quickly get it done during the week and get ahead of things. Unfortunately, by the time the weekend came along and I looked back at this model, I really wish I did things differently. And I just didn't rush it so much, and I also thought it would be a really great model to make a high and low poly model workflow as if it was going to be used for a video game or something, since I do get asked quite frequently about that. So I decided to go back and redo it on the weekend and make a quick video about it, which will be uploaded to my Patreon page if you're interested in checking it out, and that will also be linked in the description below. We'll talk about that more later on in the video and go over a few things, but for now I just want to create this high poly RC controller. So if you take a look at this reference, there seems to be different levels or layers to this model. One for the bottom, one for the middle, and one for the top. And there's even another one for the other top components. So I decided to approach it just like that, by slowly building up each layer while preview smoothing the objects along the way, so I could slowly refine them until I was happy with how they looked. Now I wasn't worried about replicating this model exactly or anything, I was more or less just using it as somewhat of a guidance. But in the end, I ended up incorporating majority of the ideas into my model. So I decided to start off with the cube and start blocking out roughly those main shapes. Now I did end up cutting it in half and just working on one side to make my life a lot easier. And once I was happy with how this side looked, I could just duplicate it and merge it together to create the other side. Now I'm just going to take my time and slowly build up these layers as I explained earlier. And I'm just going to keep hitting 3 on my keyboard to preview smooth it to see how the edge loops I'm adding are supporting the edges, and hopefully I can slowly make this look similar to our reference. Now it's important to remember that things are going to look pretty bad for a while, and you just have to keep refining the shape and keep working on it, and slowly but surely it will slowly look better and hopefully more like our reference photo. I also didn't plan out this model too much, I more or less just jumped into it and started playing around with shapes, and this also dragged out the process a little bit more, so as you'll see I just need to experiment with a few things by adding edge loops in certain areas and just smoothing it to see how it looks. But if I planned this out a little bit ahead of time, I probably could have saved myself a lot of time in the whole creation of this asset. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you like these videos and want to see more random 3D models. And if you also want to see this full video in a real-time pace, as well as seeing the whole UV mapping process or get access to all of the working files, all of that will be available on my Patreon page, and you can find that in the link in the description below. So all I'm doing here is adding a few edge loops, that way I can select some of those faces and circularize them to create that little circle imprint wherever that joystick goes. I'm also going to extrude in some of those bottom faces, that way I can create that small area where those bottom buttons go. And as you'll see, I just keep inserting edge loops everywhere to strengthen some of these edges. Now don't get me wrong, this is a little bit messy since there's just edge loops that are wrapping around the whole model, but I'm not really worried about topology. I just want to get the main shapes into place. I really find for myself personally, I work a lot better by not focusing on topology too much at the beginning, just basically getting the main shapes into place, and I can always clean things up later on, especially when I start all of the UVs. I do go ahead later on and remove a lot of these edge loops that are wrapping around the back, so I just wanted to make a note of that since it does look a little bit messy at the moment, but like I said, I just want to start blocking things out and getting things into place first. Alright, so next up was blocking out that little button joystick below the main joystick. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm just going to select those faces and extrude that outwards to block out that small area. Alright, so next was creating a small extrusion right where that main joystick goes, so I'm going to select some of those faces into a rectangle shape. I can just extrude that downwards and just remove those faces. I'm going to create that as a separate object where that actual joystick sits. And then I'm just going to continue refining, so I'm just going to continue adding some edge loops and extruding some other faces so I can slowly block out those main shapes, those main levels or layers I was talking about earlier. Alright, so next up was that top handle, so very similar to everything else in the scene. We're going to select some of those faces. I can extrude those upwards and slowly block out that handle shape. Once again, keeping it very blocked out, low polys. And then I know when I add that smoothing effect later on, it will curve these edges much more and give it that smoothing effect, like it looks like in our reference. So lately I've been having this random issue where my recording software just randomly stops recording. Luckily I did catch it not too long after it stopped recording, but as you can see, I just continued adding edge loops and kept refining things and slowly built up these shapes. Now at this point, there's a bunch of edge loops and it looks pretty messy, I'm not gonna lie. So I'm just gonna try cleaning things up, removing some unnecessary edge loops wherever I don't need them, and I can try to get everything into quads. I don't want anything more than 4 sides, and I want to ideally put everything into quads if I can. Now triangles are totally okay. Don't think you can't use them, but like I mentioned, you do want to try to get everything in quads if you can. It's going to make everything much cleaner later on once we smooth these objects out. Hopefully you won't get any weird artifacts and strange things happening in your surface of your materials. So the cleaner you can get your meshes, the better they're going to look in those final renders. Alright, so next on the list was that antenna that sits on the very top. So once again, I'm going to select some of those faces and I'm going to extrude those upwards to create that area where that antenna is going to live. And once again, adding a few edge loops to strengthen up those edges, so once I smooth it out, hopefully it retains that shape. I also need to work on the back of this object. I haven't been really focusing on that, and I don't want it looking too plain. I like the idea in my reference of some sort of like plugin on the very back. So once again, we're going to select some of those faces and extrude it to block out that area. Alright, so next up is creating that small little button or smaller joystick that sits right below the large joystick. And that's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to start off with a cube and slowly block out that small shape and fit it into that small cutout. Alright, so next up was working on our joystick. So what I'm going to start off with is a plane. I can just position that right where that cutout is, and I can start extruding some of those faces to roughly block out a shape similar to our reference photo. Now I am going to create this joystick on one side before I duplicate it over to the other. That way they can share the same UV space. Since these joysticks are the same shape and the same color, I feel like I can get away with them sharing the same UV space and having the same materials. That way it can just save me room for more materials and more textures in my UV map. Now once again, I'm not going to worry about getting this joystick perfect right off the bat and have it just replicated very similar to my reference. I just want to roughly block out those shapes so it's similar, and then I can always refine it later on. Alright, so things are slowly coming together. Next up is that bottom switch that sits on the very bottom right corner of this controller. So all I'm going to do is just straighten up some of these edges and roughly block out an area that I can extrude in to create that button or switch. And then for the button or switch itself, I'm just going to simply insert a cube and scale that into roughly a rectangle shape to fit into that extrusion. And then we can add a few edge loops and extrude some of those faces to give it a bumpy, riveted kind of look. Alright, so next up is creating some booleans so we can fit some small screws into our model. So I'm going to insert a low poly cylinder and I can position that where I want that boolean to go, and I can simply boolean to create a hole. Now, of course, you have to go in afterwards and clean up the topology. Now, this is something that I would have done differently, I believe. So later on in the video, I'll show you when I create that high and low poly model, I do approach it a little bit differently. So right now I can make these cylinders quite low in polys because I know I'm going to smooth it out. So the amount of polys doesn't really matter since it's going to be smoothed out later on. However, you can keep your general model in much lower in poly and just increase the amount of polys on the cylinder. That way it booleans out more of a circle shape, and that way when I smooth out my object, I don't need to increase the divisions to potentially 2 or even 3 to have it really smoothed out. I can even keep it on 1 or even not smooth it at all and just have it looking nice and rounded because my cylinder is higher in polys to begin with. So right now, for example, it's a 6-sided cylinder, so when I boolean it out, it's looking very blocked out and low in polys. And like I said, I'm just basically relying on my smoothing modifier I'm going to add later on to smooth out this or round out this shape. So there's different ways you can approach your model depending on how it's going to be used. Now we will go over this later on in the video, but for now, let's just continue modifying these shapes. Now, as you can see, while we did these booleans, I also made this small object on the very top corner. It's basically just going to be a little rubber piece that sits on top of the controller plastic, as well as a tiny feet on the very bottom. It's just a simple cylinder, and I extruded some faces to give it a similar shape like my reference. Alright, so now that we have the main shapes in place, we can go ahead and duplicate this whole side of our controller over and then merge it together. Alright, so now that it looks more like a real RC controller, we can go ahead and create our antenna. So I'm just going to go ahead and select some of those faces on the very top. We can circularize those and extrude those upwards to create the little area that the antenna is going to sit into. And then for the antenna itself, it's just going to be a simple cylinder. I'm going to fit that right into that area I just extruded, and then we can extrude that upwards to create the length of my antenna. So I realized I've been really avoiding the back of this model and I don't want it to look too plain, so we need to do a little bit of work on here. Now, one thing I didn't add was that little clip where the battery pack sits. So I'm gonna select some faces and extrude it inwards to create a little area where I can add a clip. That way it acts as if some pack or some little cover I can pull off. And like always, I'm not really worrying about topology right now. I just wanna get this main shape blocked out and then we can always clean things up after. So right now there's no way to actually remove the plastic cover to access the battery. So all I'm going to do is add some edge loops. I'm using my multi-cut tool just to add some edges right around to basically block out an area that I want this battery back cover to live. And all I'm going to do is just extrude those faces inwards to fake that seam. It's not actually going to be a separate object. We're just going to fake it since the battery cover or plastic cover is not actually going to ever come off. Now I could have added this seam for the battery pack directly into the materials and not have to actually extrude some of those faces into the geometry. However, if you can afford to add it into your geometry, you're usually going to get better results, especially when viewing it up close. So I thought since this is a high poly model, why not just add that seam into the geometry? Alright, so we only have a few objects left. One of them is that back controller attachment piece. So it looks like there's a plugin that some wire or something can go into. Not exactly sure what the attachment is called, but I'm just gonna basically copy it right out of my reference photo. So all I'm gonna do is select some of those faces and circularize them and extrude that inwards to create some depth so that object can fit into. And then I can just add in a small cylinder as that attachment plug-in piece, and I can fit that right into my small extrusion and roughly block out some attachment piece similar to my reference photo. Alright, so next up I wanted to add some more screws on the very back of my cover. So very similar to how I did the other ones, I'm just going to add some low poly cylinders. I can position those where I want to boolean out some holes for my screws. We also need to add a screen onto our controller, which is probably important. So we're going to add a small plane, and I can scale that down and position that right where that screen goes. So in the reference photo, there's a small red light right in the middle. So we're going to do the exact same thing. And you probably guessed it, we are going to add a small low poly cylinder, and then I can boolean out a very small hole so I can insert a small sphere as that little light. Alright, so next up is that small metal piece that sits right below the red light. Now I'm not 100% sure what this is, but I believe it's an attachment piece that you can like attach a string to that's maybe tied around your neck. I'm not exactly sure, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but we need to add it because it seems pretty important and it seems to be on a lot of RC controllers that I Google online. So all I'm going to do for this is start off with a small cylinder. I can delete those front and back faces and then just fill in that hole. That way I can add, and using my multi-cut tool, attach some vertices to create some rectangle shape that I can then extrude outwards to give it a similar shape to my reference. Alright, so we're almost done. Next up is creating those small little buttons that sit on the very bottom. And that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to start off with a cube, scale that into a cylinder shape, bevel out those outside edges so I can round them out to give it a similar look like that rounded button. And then I can just position that on the very bottom of my controller. Alright, so I wasn't even planning on adding these, but in my reference photo and on a lot of RC controllers, there's these tiny little joystick looking things on the very top corners of this controller. And I just decided last minute to add it. So where it's going to insert the cylinder, and I can just roughly block out what that small joystick switch shape looks like. So the main shapes are complete now. At this point, we just need to actually add a smoothing effect to this object. So I'm just going to smooth it out, and unfortunately one smooth wasn't enough. I was still seeing some rough block out corners, so I'm just going to increase those divisions up to 2. It is going to add a lot of polys to this model, but it is going to look very smooth. Alright, so at the last minute, I did realize when I duplicated one half of my controller to the other side, basically mirrored it over, it did mirror over that same switch that sits on the very bottom corner. And I only need one switch, I don't need switches on both sides. So we're just going to really quickly go in, delete all of those faces, I can reattach them together. That way, there's no switch on the left. Alright, so I actually lied. There were a few small things I wanted to quickly add in before we wrapped up this model. One of them was the joystick. So in the reference, it's very spiky, and I like that material and I liked how it looked in the reference. So I'm just going to mimic or copy that same sort of thing on mine. So I'm just going to select some of those vertices and just pull them outwards to give it some sort of sharpy, pointy end. Another thing were the screws on the back of my controller. So right now I have that flat head sort of screw shape that I have on the very front, but I thought it'd be cool to add different screws on the back, kind of like a Phillips head. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start off with a cylinder. I can bevel out those top edges to round it out, and then I can just create a sort of cross Phillips head shape, and I can boolean that right into the top of my cylinder, and then of course clean it up with the multi-cut and target weld tool, and then I can position those screws right into those booleans we created earlier on the back of the controller. I thought just adding a different variation of screw would just make it a little bit more interesting to look at. And the very last object I decided to add was just a small plane or background object right behind the switch that's below my screen. So there's 2 switches there that's beside my joystick. Unlike the one on the bottom that I just created the back face directly into the geometry, so it's part of the controller, I thought it'd be cool to have a different shape, some sort of extrusion, some line that looked like the joystick or little button kind of fit into. I just thought it would fill up that empty space rather than just having it completely black in the renders. Adding something in the background would maybe possibly make it more interesting to look at. Alright, so really quickly let's go over how I did those UVs. I want to talk a little bit about this high and low poly model workflow I was talking about earlier, and then we can just jump into Substance Painter and start texturing. Alright, so here's the model in its finished form. I thought that we should just fit it into one texture map because it would just make sense for an object like this. I don't think it needs more than one texture. So I did decide to cut this thing up, trying to follow the seams on the corners, and I just fit everything into one UV map. So all these switches on one side are just sharing the same UV space. So these two over here are just overlapping. As well as all the screws, they're sharing the same UV space. And I did a few things different. So these buttons, I made sure they're just in different positions. That way I can have a different rubber effect so it didn't look too repeating. And I also made sure that on like this UV shell, I just wanted it pretty large because I am gonna have text here. Now I did rush these UVs, I'm not gonna lie, it was causing me a bit of issues. To be honest with you, it crashed a few times, I had to redo my work, so I was getting pretty frustrated and I just rushed a few things. So if I could go back, I would have approached it differently, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and I'm gonna show you exactly what I mean by that. Now don't get me wrong, this is nice, high poly mesh, I'm still really happy with it. But what I thought would be a fun idea was creating a high and low poly model workflow, since I get asked about that a lot and how I would go about this. So I have these two examples here, and let me show you what exactly I did. So here are two examples I did, one high and one low poly. Now, please don't pay attention too much to the topology. For example, here's a face that's way more than 4 sides, and I should have attached it like this side with one vertex to make it those 4 sides. So there's a bunch of, I'm sure I didn't spend too long on this. I just, at the last minute on the weekend, I thought it'd be helpful to show all of you what I would do. I don't want to always teach you necessarily bad habits. I want to show you good approaches that you could use to tackle some of these models. So here's an example of a high and low poly model. Now I am going to upload a full video of this to my Patreon page. So if you are interested in seeing the full depth and narrated real-time video of this, I will be uploading it there, which you can find in the link in the description, but I just really quickly want to show you what I mean. So right now I have a lower poly model. Obviously it's much lower in polys, and a lot of these edges aren't even beveled, so these edges I didn't necessarily even need to bevel. And then once I had this done and it was UV'd, so like this, now there's extra room up here for the other objects, but I just use the outside shell as the example. I can duplicate this over and create a higher poly version. So what I did for this one was similar to how I did the other. I added a bunch of edge loops, and they do need to be always sitting in the same place. I just moved it over to show you. But for this one, very similar to the other one, I just added a bunch of edge loops and quickly smoothed it. Now, of course, it's not as clean as my other high poly mesh because I did it really, really fast for this example, but it's an example of how you would use a high and low poly model workflow. So I would export this low poly shell as my low poly version, and I can import that into Substance Painter, and then I can load this in as my high poly mesh. So usually we check on that option as you use low poly mesh as high poly mesh when we're about to bake out our textures. In this situation, we would just load in this object as our high poly mesh, and we can texture on this higher poly one. That way, afterwards, when we need to use this model in game, I can use the textures created from this high poly and project it onto the low poly. So a lot of these edges, like these hard edges right here that only have, one edge to it, they would look more round, similar to our reference, because it's taking that curvature information and normal information, and it can just project that onto this mesh. Now, once again, if you want to see how that's done, I will be uploading a video to my Patreon page, but it's just to show you there's different ways you can go about creating models depending on how they're going to be used. I was originally just wanting to create this high poly one just for fun, and then afterwards, like I mentioned on the weekend, I was like, oh damn, that's pretty high in polys. I probably should have showed people how to create a lower poly one. So hopefully that's helpful. Like I said, if you're interested, check out my Patreon page. Now we can just jump over to Substance Painter and we can start texturing. All right, so jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our high poly mesh from Maya. So what I decided to do was basically take advantage of Substance Painter smart materials and regular materials and use those as the main bases like usual, and then we can refine them and adjust them as we go. I don't want to spend too long on the whole texturing process, and taking advantage of these Substance Painter presets and built-in materials can really help speed up that process and work off a really nice foundation that you can build off of. So what I decided to start off with was that plastic used soft smart material that comes with Substance, and I can use that as my main base plastic material for my controller. Now, of course, I need to change the color from that beige light color to more of a black, as well as adjust that outside white edge wear. I want to make that a little bit more dark so it's not so obvious. And once I'm happy with how it's looking, I can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to whatever meshes I want to assign that plastic material to. Next, I decided to use that silver armor material for all of those metal pieces. They're pretty clean and shiny, so I can remove a lot of that wear that comes with that smart material and just keep it a little bit more clean looking. As well as the buttons on the bottom, I just use that rubber material that comes with Substance Painter, the rubber tire, and just simply assign it to those meshes as well as the ones on the very top, those little corner pieces. I also decided to make those that rubber material as well. Alright, so next up were those labels on the very bottom. So I just decided to follow my reference photo and basically copy those same colors and textures just to make my life a little bit easier so I didn't have to really think about it too much. So I just used a square alpha to basically draw in that background white box around each button. And then I used the same process, adding another fill layer on top of it that was more of a blue color, and using the same process just basically drew on that blue strip that's right over that white box that I created. Now I did rush this, of course. I could have spent a little bit more time here to make it a bit more clean, but I just wanted to get through this whole texturing process as quick as I can, so we're just gonna speed everything up a bit. And then for the text, I just used those pre-built-in fonts that come with Substance Painter. I chose one that was fitting and just wrote in those words and pasted them onto that blue material. And same thing for all the other text and markings on this object. For this one, I just decided to use a fill layer and turn off all the channels except for the height, and then I could just add in a little arrow on my switch as well as the other markings all over my plastic material. And once again, I did rush this. If I could go back and really redo anything with the materials, one of the biggest things would be all these little markings. I just did it very rushed and, in my opinion, a little bit sloppy. So I wish I spent a little bit more time here. Alright, so next was creating that front large label. So I just jumped into Photoshop and made my own label, and then I just exported that as a PNG, dragged that into this project as a texture, and I can just basically project and paste this directly onto that mesh. Alright, so next were those plastic pieces, rubber pieces on the side, and I just experimented a bit. I used that plastic grip material that comes with Substance Painter. It has a little bit of a bump effect, and I thought that'd be fitting for these outside rubber pieces. So I'm just going to drag that material onto my layers, turn it to a black mask, and I can assign it to those meshes. Alright, so after zooming back and looking at the model, I thought all the materials were looking too similar and I wanted more variation in color. So I'm just going to reuse that same plastic material we used at the beginning for our main base, and I'm just going to reassign those to that bottom plastic piece where the labels are, as well as the top corner rubber pieces. That way I can make it a bit more gray, and hopefully it can make it, just in my opinion, a little bit more interesting to look at and not so plain, and more variation in those colors. I also thought it'd be really cool to add some fingerprints, so I'm gonna add another fill layer. I'm gonna turn off all the channels except for just the roughness. I can go choose those fingerprint alphas that come with Substance Painter, and I can just paste those directly onto that plastic mesh. So hopefully when that light hits it, you can see some fingerprints on that material. Alright, so next I wanted to add some more bump or grip on those back finger pieces, basically where you hold onto the controller. In the reference photo, they have lots of rivets and bumps, and I really like how that looks, and I didn't end up adding that into the geometry, so I thought we would just add some into the material. And I can go find some pattern. I used a procedural brush, that way I can just paste it and it can just draw on some lines similar to my reference, and then we can paste those directly on those handle pieces on the back. And same thing that we did on the very front plastic piece. The back battery pack was looking just too consistent in color and I wanted more variation. So we're gonna do the exact same thing by adding that same plastic material, and I can change the color to more of a gray or off black color. Alright, so next up was adding some text onto the screen. Now I'm not really sure what to add here, so I just copied the ones I think were in my reference, so it's hard to see from the image. But I'm just adding a fill layer and simply choosing a text or a font that comes with Substance, and we can just paste that directly onto the screen. And same goes for the text in the top corners, except for I couldn't find a font that was fitting. Everything was too thin, so I just quickly jumped into Photoshop, made some alphas just with some thicker text, and then dragged those in as alphas, and I can paste that text directly onto that rubber material. I also want to add more text on that bottom plastic piece where those buttons are. So I'm just going to copy roughly what's in my reference photo. Now I couldn't see everything, so I'm just going to make up some of it. So don't mind if some of it makes no sense, but we just want to add in some labels to make it more interesting. Alright, so things are looking good and we're almost finished the texturing. It needs a little bit more dirt or grunge. Things are looking a little bit too clean. I don't want this to be completely abused and look like it's beaten up or anything like that, but a little bit of small wear and tear will go a long way. So that's what we're going to do, is add a few fill layers. I can drag on some masking effects to add some dirt and grunge, and we can just dirty up our controller a little bit. And while looking at the back of this object, things were still looking a little bit too plain, so I just decided to choose random alphas and just imprint some random stuff into the plastic. So some speaker-like object on the bottom right and some lines that were similar to the reference photo on the top. Alright, so now it's time to jump into the renderer and see how these materials are looking. So all I did here was just check on that clear color. I just want to have a clear color, so it helped me just visualize this model a little bit easier. And at this point, it's just a matter of jumping in and out of the render and just tweaking things until they get into a state that I'm more happy with. So just refine some of those colors and tweak some of those settings and just keep refining things until I'm happy with it. I always like to add little personal touches to the models if you can, just to help make them more interesting. So I decided to add a small PR initial on the back for polyrender. And that's basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling and texturing process that I did to create this RC controller. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video. If you did, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more random weekly 3D models. And of course, all of these working files along with the real-time video, which includes the full UV mapping process, will all be uploaded to my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. And I will also be uploading a really quick video to my Patreon page, which will show more in-depth look at that high and low poly model workflow. So I actually bring those meshes into Substance Painter, texture them, export them, and relink them up on the lower poly model in Maya. So we go over that whole process, and if you're interested in seeing any of it, all of it will be available on my Patreon page. And as always, a really big thank you to all of my Patreons for your continuous support. You are all amazing, and I really can't thank you all enough. Once again, thank you so much for tuning into this week's video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next one.